going out into the world in medical school, you focus on what's wrong with people, and you get really good at that. You focus on, how can I make a diagnosis? What is your chief complaint? How can I make you a little bit less miserable? And you palpate prostates, you percuss lungs, you auscultate abdomens, and then you come up with, your diagnosis, and treatment sort of expands from that. And similarly in psychiatry, you also focus on what's wrong. And I got really good at misery and, how could I make somebody less miserable in what I was doing? And that's really what psychiatry, for the most part, is what you're trained to do. And it's really this focus on pathogenesis, which is the study and really the understanding of illness. And one day, about 10 years ago, I was seeing a patient I had seen for about 6 weeks or so, coming to my office every week. And we were discussing ways to reduce the conflict in her life, to make her a little bit less, stressed out with her kids and her job and her husband. And she came and she said, you know what, Dr. Boardman, all we ever do is talk about what's wrong with me. And we really don't talk about anything else. And I'm done. And she was right. I realized I was so focused on everything that had been going wrong and what the problems or the pathology was, and that I really hadn't focused on much else. And I ended up going back to school to study positive psychology, which is really the study of health and well-being, and the study of optimism and post-traumatic growth and resilience. And these were words, in my training, we had never heard at all. I mean, now I hear the word resilience, and I'm told my dog Panda needs to be more resilient, or my hair product's going to make my hair more resilient. But the idea that then in medical school back then, it was not something that we were trained and we learned enough about. And so I really try to apply this now in my practice, and really that's what this book is about as well, is how can we look at both sides of this? How can we actually make people feel less bad, but also can we help them feel stronger? And can we help them find wellness within their illness and strength within their everyday stress? That's where it comes from.
Well, it's good context, but for lay people, vitality. What do we mean by vitality? Is it the same as happiness? Is it different than happiness? I think one of the things that I was struck by in the book early on was the focus on, I guess, what you were calling micro stressors, as opposed to the large, more traumatic events in our life. It's those everyday little, kind of scratches at, our self that we endure, that maybe we don't even notice that we're enduring on a day-to-day basis, that really take a toll.
Well, that's what really surprised me about the research, is because I thought it would be sort of the big bad stuff that happens to people, which in general, what brings somebody into a psychiatrist's office is at these big inflection points. But it turns out research shows it's like the everyday hassles, these micro stressors that build up. And one of the reasons that is thought to be the case is because we don't have that community support and others around us. Nobody will bring you a casserole because you couldn't find a parking spot or your flight was delayed. There isn't that sense of social support embedded in it. And vitality was this word that I thought really helped me think about what sort of everyday resilience looks like, not that big R resilience that helps us recover from those more sort of major life events. And as it turns out, resilience is our default. Most people are resilient to some of that, to that, about 70 to 80% of people are resilient. And even some people have post-traumatic growth. Some people do get depressed. Some people have post-traumatic stress disorder, but resilience is the default. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough either. But vitality to me was sort of the key. It's a psychological and physical sense of that you're sort of ready for anything. You're up for the challenge. And Andrew Solomon, who's a friend of, Andrew as well, a psychologist, had said, the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's vitality. And that sense that you have that sort of vigor within you, you have the resources you feel to meet whatever challenge comes your way, because whatever stressors are, they're actually really, they're perceived stressors. That it's like, if you're feeling exhausted, overwhelmed, overworked, and you've just had a fight with your partner and you haven't eaten well, that something's going to be perceived as much more stressful than if you're actually feeling stronger in your everyday way.
And I hope, I'm being hopeful here, but I'm hoping that this doesn't mean that we all have to be happy all the time. Negative feelings, negative emotions, negative experiences are all part of being a happy person and vitality. It's about resilience, big R or little r. It's about how you respond to these, events that we all deal with.
I mean, David, you think of somebody who really understands good stress even, and that idea of, that there's sometimes, when we are stressed out, that it can be in a good way. Yeah. I think we're sometimes at our best when we're a little bit stressed out. one of my favorite studies was on rats and looking at rats who were given like their favorite treat in the world is a Fruit Loop. And apparently this is what every rat loves to eat. And if you, Kelly Lambert does this work at the University of Rochester. And so if you give one of these rats basically on a silver platter, and she called them her trust fund rats, you give them their Fruit Loop treat that apparently they love, that those rats are very happy and then they go about and have their good day. And the other rats, you bury this treat under all their bedding and they have to kind of scrounge for it and go and get it. And then when you challenge these rats though, again, and you put them in a new context, in a new maze, or you actually have them swim to something, but they're challenged in a new way, those trust fund rats give up so quickly. If they've never been challenged before, they're not going to sort of challenge themselves again because they can't even generalize this ability to adapt. And that's essentially what resilience is your ability to adapt. And I think you certainly don't need to be happy all the time. And I think sometimes we're living in this culture of toxic positivity, of just smile through it and, be happy and everything will be great. But we have a lot to learn from negative emotions.
Sure. I mean, there's so much in here that I took out. And honestly, there's so many strategies about just dealing with your day-to-day life that I'm not even going to attempt to recount them all, but I am really going to encourage everybody to read the book because it's remarkable how many, and we were talking about before, I read that and I realized that this was one thing that I do on a daily basis. Just didn't really know I was doing it. I'd never had anybody write it on a piece of paper that was actually a thing. But I think everybody will really benefit from reading the book. I said up front, me twice. It turns out that I guess as humans, we're not necessarily always so good at knowing what will make us happy. And, I think you talked about the cotton candy kind of leisure. And, I, for one, if I'm given like one 24-hour period of time in a 30-day stretch to do what I want, I generally will sit on the sofa and watch Netflix that Hamilton will have told me I missed like for the last, 6 months. And I will eat too much and I'll, get to the end of the day. And it turns out it was probably not the best use of those 24 hours. I don't know if that ties into the micro stressors, but one of the things I found most interesting in the book was, as you sort of engage in day-to-day life and you try and find joy and levity and happiness and purpose, it was less stripping stuff out of your life, strip out stress, strip out negativity, strip out conflict. It was more about actually more life, more activity, getting out there, more friends, being outside, finding a hobby. We're not so good at knowing what makes us happy, are we?
I think in theory, like we actually know, we just don't do it.
Right.
Like we're pretty lazy most of the time. And so we don't really need more information that we know we're going to probably feel better if we go for that run or, we read that book instead of, binge watching Netflix. And there is this people who feel quite guilty and actually more depleted after a weekend when they spent like the weekend in bed. It's called the guilty couch potato syndrome. And you just feel awful and depleted. And when you haven't sort of stretched yourself, and a study just came out, and it's not in the book, though, looking at people who spend any of their free time. I know you told me you don't have any free time, but who spend their free time in a completely unproductive way. And, boredom can also, I think, and when we feel like we're not really doing anything that feels meaningful to us. And one thing I always ask my patients to do is to think about is when I first meet them is like, what do you value most in your life? Like, what do you care most deeply about? What do you stand for? And then to think about, how do you spend your time? And and even they'll say like, well, what do you mean? Even like, how do you spend your time on Saturday? And then to really think about those hours, where did they go? And even for, most of us will say, well, we don't have any free time, but, I know when I get like my alert every Sunday about how many hours I was on my cell phone, like I realized like, maybe I did have some free time that I was like looking at things that I shouldn't have, that weren't necessarily making me feel good. And nobody's ever felt like, oh, I'm so glad I stared at Instagram, on their deathbed for so long. But this idea, though, that we're actually sort of squandering so much of our time that could be more meaningfully spent in ways. And, looking at a study that came out of Harvard Business School was people who had a hobby, something they did after work that was meaningful to them in some way. And I use the word hobby in a way that, I was interviewing an assistant a few months ago and asking like, what hobbies do you have? And she looked at me like I was asking about her mastery of the Dewey Decimal System, like hobby? Like, what do you mean? Do I collect stamps? And it's not what, my intention, but the idea of having things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you in some way. And just it's fun. It's actually the purest form of love, something you do just for the love of doing it. And so even when you are having, like, that can be part of your bad day backup plan, something that feels meaningful to you, that you feel like you're engaged in, and where even you can lose yourself in, where you're sort of losing that sense of time, where you're so engaged in, and it might be athletic, it might be just creative, or just any other domain outside of what you do. So I know your work's really important here, but I hope you're also doing things outside of this that are meaningful.
No, I hope everybody is definitely. I mean, there's no way to. I was having this conversation with somebody I was talking to an hour or two ago. I mean, everybody in this room and on this video works so hard, and the dedication and the hours balancing, family and work, and never mind quarantine or COVID, and the realities of the world are intense. It's impossible to do this if it's not sustainable. And coming up with, I guess, more practice and purpose on how to get better at creating sustainability and creating space in all of our lives only actually serves all purposes. It serves your family, but it serves the job, because if it's not sustainable, it doesn't really work. I guess it gets me to another topic, which I found a lot of took a lot of intrigue out of, which is just the focus on otherness. The world today, not wrongly, but has a tremendous focus on self-help and introspection, and going off on a solo retreat or a solo walk, and really kind of bettering yourself in a vacuum, versus otherness and being part of a larger purpose, a larger good, giving. How do you find that in terms of people's day-to-day vitality?
Well, I think psychology and psychiatry has become so sort of focused on the individual, and this idea that, like, happiness is all in your head. And it's, in the actions you take and the connections you make and how you participate. It's sort of when you're thinking outside of your body and you are doing something in the service of something else, or with others in some way. And I'd had this patient once who promoted and was in this sort of leadership position and had to give a sort of a meeting, and had to run a meeting every Monday morning. And he would be super overwhelmed and have these panic attacks thinking about, how stressful it was going to be having to speak publicly. And it was incredibly stressful for him to do this. And he would say every time before he got up to speak, his, hands would start shaking, and his, like, sweat would start pouring down his forehead, and his heart would be racing, and he couldn't breathe. And he felt like he was really going to get sick physically. And one day he was watching Bruce Springsteen perform, be interviewed on one of those talk shows.
Yeah.
And Bruce Springsteen, I guess everyone here hopefully knows who that is. And
I really hope so. This should have been a job interview question.
In front of 15,000 people. And, so it's like was saying, hey, Bruce, how is it? I think it was David Letterman, like, how is it that you can perform in front of all these people? Doesn't it ever stress you out? Doesn't it feel, don't you ever get anxious? And apparently his response was, it feels amazing. Like, my heart starts racing. I kind of feel like my breath's getting more shallow, and my hands are shaking. I've got these sweaty palms. I've got these beads of sweat on my forehead, and my knees are weak. And it's this message my body's telling me that I'm just ready to rock. And this idea, in a way, that, like, how you interpret something really shapes your experience of it and your perception of that. And so from then on, he would be like, he was thinking, like, what would Bruce do? And I know, like, whenever we give people advice, we'll be like, just be yourself. And sometimes that's really bad advice, because, you'll run out the room, or, being yourself is really not, always a good idea. And even in relationships, when people say, oh, be yourself. Well, we actually feel better and more connected when we're acting like the best version of ourselves, and which isn't necessarily being this true self. And I have a whole chapter in there about, like, you can stop trying to find yourself, because that sort of is predicated on this idea that there's this fixed core, like, you are who you are, and denying this idea that we're constantly changing. I mean, I think we're all works in progress who mistakenly think that we're finished in some way. But, this idea that you are going to change, let's just sort of change intentionally, and change hopefully in the direction that you'd like to be changing. But also, though, that you're many selves. There are many versions of who you are. There are many hats that you wear. I know, like, I've got my worst self. I doubt you do, but there's this better version of ourselves. And sometimes the best way to tap into, like, the better version of ourselves is to think about, what would somebody you admire do right now? Who are the role models you have in your life? We know that even, like, young women going into the sciences, if they have role models, that sort of helps them sort of imagine who they are. Even if any of you have young kids at home, ask or they need to study or do their homework, say, what would Batman do right now? And you can tap into, I think we get closer to that more motivated self, and I think that better version of the person we'd like to be, when we can tap into the strengths of others we respect and sort of, you know, rely on. It could be somebody you know, it could be Michelle Obama, it could be somebody, you know, your third grade, you know, teacher. But I think, again, like that sense of transcending oneself, I think we have, you know, tremendous support from others, and, you know, tapping into the strengths and capabilities that can help us sort of channel them on our own.
I mean, there's so much there, and this, I guess, you know, ties into the, you know, the focus and maybe the over focus on self-help, and, you know, but the concept of authenticity. And it's, you know, it's a hot word and it's a hot topic, and I'm sure that the answer is gray. It's neither here nor there, but, you know, is there something wrong with wanting to be the best version of yourself? And maybe the authentic self is probably somebody that can stay home every once in a while. And so, you know, it's that picture of the duck gliding across the pond with the, you know, the feet working so hard underneath the water. Is that something to really be, you know, kind of ashamed of, or is that maybe aspirational and gets us all to kind of step up a little bit?
Well, I think this idea of like that true self, though, that we can drill down and find it, that's a myth, though. But then to be that, I mean, what does that really mean anyway? And I don't think that I've never found anybody who's actually found their true self, or their, you know, in their way, because again, that they're changing. But also, I think when we are sort of lifting our out of ourselves, I mean, looking at research at this is for kids, but we've also seen it in saving money and people losing weight. When we ask people, instead of sort of focusing on yourself, if you're looking for motivation, instead of focusing on your sort of true self in sort of helping you achieve or get you from where you are to where you want to be, we know kids know how to study, they know what they should be doing. People know the information, they know how to lose weight or how they should be saving money. But actually what gets them to change their behavior, which I think is so interesting, is getting them to give advice to others. And if you put them in this position of being a giver, if you ask 7th grade students to give advice to 5th grade students, not only do those 5th grade students actually take the advice from peers much more, and they're much more likely to follow through, and it's much better than any of the parents out there, like, save your breath, get like an older kid to give that kid advice, because I should have known when my kids' eyes were glazing over when I was trying to give them advice about good study habits. But again, that idea of, if you become a giver and you're in the position of giving advice, you're much more likely then to follow through. You're going to walk your walk, and you're going to tap into that motivation. So I think having that other orientation is so important in our everyday lives. It was a study that came out of Chicago looking at, I think it was people over 65 who were tapped by 12th grades in the public schools to help with college advice. And these senior citizens were asked to help interview the kids. They could be ready for college and help them with their applications. And what was super interesting was it was very helpful for those students who had access to very good college advising along the way. But more importantly, 80% of those senior citizens felt that their life satisfaction had improved. And again, that sense of doing something for somebody else that feels meaningful to you, that taps into your values. And there's really, it's probably the best antidote for stress we have, is doing things for another.
I mean, without sort of, getting into every one of them, are there, sort of the most typical pitfalls that we all run into on a daily basis? I mean, are there any common themes? I'm sure there are a lot of common themes, but any worth talking about right now that we can all be on the lookout of what holds us up on a daily basis? I will tell you, the one that jumped out at me personally was rumination. That one I got down pat.
It sounds like you've got a good way to get out of ruminations. This is so interesting that David told me one way you do it, that we should study you at this point.
Sure. I'm sure it can be studied. Yeah.
But the idea, rumination is that, that ticker tape in your mind, like, you just can't get that thing out of your head. Like, oh, I'm such an idiot. Why did I say that? Why did I do that? And that sort of, that constant worry of like what could go wrong, what has gone wrong, or, what will go wrong. And it's really an on-ramp to depression, rumination, when we're just sort of stewing and dwelling in our thoughts and our in that sort of negative emotion. And so one of the best ways to deal with rumination, I mean, does anyone here have rumination? I was going to say, wow, if you don't. I mean, I think it's something we're all vulnerable to, and sort of thinking about it. But one of the best paths out of it, though, is to what's called self-distance. And self-distance is when you either can imagine, like, what would your future self think of this right now? and immediately pulling yourself out of that. And even they've done this like with couples who like are asked to like talk about a fight they recently had, like from that sort of self-immersed perspective, like tell me exactly how you were feeling and exactly how angry you were. And that's never a good idea when you're just recounting exactly and you're sort of reliving these emotions and you're sort of stewing in that and you're ruminating about it. Versus when you kind of have this distance and you can either be thinking, what would I tell a friend at this moment? What would my future self say? What would a fly on the wall say? Or what would somebody I admire? What would they do in this moment? To give you that sense of distance. And these are like really simple tools that really help with cognitive reappraisal. And a study that came out looking at 27,000 people who were more resilient and found and reported more resilience during lockdown across, I think it was 17 different countries. And that those who were capable of this cognitive reappraisal, being able to sort of rethink and take perspective of the moment that they were in. And I mean, I think that maybe it's something intuitively some people do anyway, and kind of to give themselves perspective, but some of us have to learn it.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're talking about distance now. And I mean, I think it was, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but Dr. Almeida,
Yes, yeah.
talking about Teflon people and Velcro people. And, you know, what I found also interesting was, you know, the whole concept of we write these narratives for ourselves. I mean, you can go through events on a daily basis, either micro stressors or serious macro stressors, and they're traumatic. And is it as much the substance of the trauma that you go through or the narrative that you write about it post-mortem that really dictates how you come out of it? Because I think that whether it's distancing or it's being more Teflon and less Velcro, but it's just writing narratives that, you know, are about resilience and about, you know, kind of moving through things, I think, you know, at least for me, have been very important in my life, filled with a bunch of mistakes and, you know, less than ideal outcomes, but it's about the narratives you write about yourself.
The stories we tell, yeah.
The stories we tell. And but very relatedly, what I was sort of referencing before, what you had written in the book that was, I guess, not original to me, was what you call the time travel trick, which is often when I'm going through something that's a little, you know, stressful or trying, you know, in the moment, you know, and I have no interest in being my authentic self. I try and work forward, you know, some period of time and be like, all right, once you're on the other side of this, how do you wish the story was written? How do you wish the narrative was written? How would you like to have behaved in a situation like this? And I think I have found that helpful. I'm sure there are a bunch of tricks out there.
I love that you intuitively do that, and that's sort of a natural thing. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about all the probably intuitive things that you're doing. I will have to
clear the sofa and lie down.
But it is so interesting because, you know, what helps with that self-distancing, or your trick even, you know, that time travel that you're able to do, is because not only does it sort of get you thinking more clearly about it, is what it does also is it kind of gives you a sort of runway to action. And so again, like kind of getting that, like the idea that happiness isn't just in your head. You're not just going to have these sort of insights and, oh yeah, like unless you're acting on that. And there's like a lot of research out there too, just saying like thinking positively is not going to sort of get you where you want to be. And what can you do to kind of close that intention action gap? Because it was a German researcher looking at like all these people are trying to think positive in America, and it really isn't that helpful. I mean, you can think positively about anything you want to, but it actually really undermines, like in the moment you might feel good about it, but it's not going to be sustainable. So how do you close that intention action gap? And obviously it's around taking action. And what she had done was this research looking at what she called whoop goals and saying, okay, what's your wish? Like what would be that dream that would happen? And then the W stands for wish, and then O would be the outcome. Like how would that make you really feel inside? But the second part is what's so important. The other OP, WOOP is the whole acronym, is what's the obstacle? Identify the obstacle that's interfering with you getting that thing done. Is it like you want to connect more with your kids? Is it the obstacle is having your phone next to you? Is that it? And then what's your plan? How are you going to manage that? And I think that's just, again, like an action-oriented strategy that is really helpful to kind of get you out of your head.
Sure. No, I mean, I'm sure different, you know, tricks or strategies resonate differently for different people, but that was a big one for me. The other one was to focus on sort of the null hypothesis, or the null set or null hypothesis of just, you know, sort of playing out the alternative scenario in your mind, which is you can manifest how things go terribly wrong and kind of, you know, cumulatively one on top of the other, but playing out the, well, what if the opposite was true, kind of opens up your thought process and your mindset to accepting that maybe there's a different reality that you can manifest.
And I think that sort of taps into even when we're speaking to others who are having a hard time, or to kids who are stressed out, you know, because you can say like, tell me again exactly what happened. You can relive it, or even give them some of those tools to gain some distance if it is sort of channeling their inner scientist to look for the null hypothesis, or or it can be sort of thinking of their future self. What would they tell them, or a friend, to sort of get them out of it? Because we know that co-rumination can also be, again, depressogenic for people. So to try to lift them out of that and help them come up with their own solutions, and sort of say, like, moving forward then, and even like feedback, we know, like with managers too, is sort of, rather than focusing on maybe what has gone wrong, like moving forward, what's going to be the path, what do you plan to do next time?
Sure. Switching gears a little bit, because I'm sensitive to time and I want to make sure we have room for everybody's questions, but in a work environment, because, we all do spend a lot of time together now, more and more in the office. First part is, you talk about flow in the book, which I love the whole thought process there, but what's the role of passion in all of our lives, our personal lives, our hobbies, our adventures, and our work life? I mean, how important is that? Often when, we're meeting people who want to, join the company and, talk about, how and who is successful here, I think one of the things I at least always start with, like, you just have to love what you do, because if you're trying to jam a circle into a square for the rest of your life, it's likely not going to go well. And you have to just, innately be passionate, not all the time. But how do you see the role of passion in life?
I can be contrarian about it a little bit, and I'll push back with you a little bit on that. But I think the idea, though, obviously, like interest, like if there is no interest to begin with, it's really hard with anybody to get them sort of excited to do anything and to sustain that. And one thing I think we often take out of anything that is interesting for people is, like, we make it so joyless. I mean, you see that in schools and even in work, like drudgery kicks in. And I think the lack of playfulness and joy is problematic. But what I've always sort of had an issue with is when people are told, like, follow your passion.
Right.
Because it's not necessarily sustainable either. And that, like, does hard work lead to passion, or does passion lead to hard work? And obviously it goes both ways. And I think that, it is, you will be more gritty and more resilient, obviously, when there's interest to begin with. And that sort of begets then like a hard work, and then you're sort of able to sustain it. So the interest has to be there, like from the get-go. But I think when you sort of can work hard, and then that fuels passion, and it feels meaningful to you, and then, you're able to then work hard and sort of push your limits and find even more passion in doing it. Because otherwise it just becomes drudgery in some way, like where it's just like not fun. And I think we see that all the time in schools. I just saw the study on college students, when if they are actually allowed to take breaks, hang out with their friends, or they allow themselves to take breaks and hang out with friends, not like rather than holding up in the library, not only are they going to like have a better time doing it, they're actually going to master the material better as well. So I think that important sort of point of connecting with others, connecting with other people who share that kind of passion, doing things with others. I have patients who say, like, oh, I just want to get to the gym and I just can't get myself to do it. And there have been studies looking at what they call temptation bundling, where you think of something you really love doing, and maybe that is listening to like a great podcast or binge watching Outer Banks or whatever you're watching. And it's making that the only time you can do it is when you're at the gym. So that would be like, again, like coupling something that's really fun with something you really don't feel like doing. And, it's just ways to kind of add the joy back into behaviors, and making the behaviors you want to do more fun or easier. And looking at studies of people who work out with a friend, it's much more sustainable. And people live longer who play kind of group sports and play tennis, or, play on a soccer team. Because I think there is that sort of that. Obviously the physical activity is important, but when you're doing it with others, it's even like there's even more of a benefit.
Maybe I said it wrong. I don't, at least in my mind, when I think about passion and sort of bringing that to your life, it doesn't mean every day is all easy and, not full of obstacles and hurdles. And I think we were talking about it in the context of parenting, and just sort of the benefits of good stress and adversity and resilience and all these things. I think, what I was sort of conceiving of is, the person who goes to UPenn and decides that they just have to be an investment banker because that's what everybody from UPenn does. If you don't have that actual passion to be an investment banker, which would make you a very special human, it's probably a rough thing to sign up to for the rest of your life. And I don't think that pursuing a passion means it's all going to just be easy sailing from there. So I'm in total agreement about the benefit of adversity and stress and harnessing it and channeling it and utilizing it, because any, at least in my life, any version of just expectations that it's all going to go in a linear way has never materialized.
Yeah, I mean, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson curve where you're looking at like people really their peak performance is when they're slightly stressed out in some way, and that they are feeling sort of most like sort of strongest. And you can obviously see this with athletes, but in other ways, like we are probably most productive when we
Sure.
are like a little bit stretched beyond and kind of finding that sweet spot. And it's, sometimes we're the last to know when we've gotten to the other side of that curve. And it's usually the
Right.
people around us who are like, wait a minute, like you're not like,
Right.
you're irritable or you're difficult to deal with. But sometimes, I mean, that's something just in terms of, I think of myself as a positive psychiatrist, but also I'm a big believer in negative emotions
Right.
and being able to process them and understand them and take them as information for what they are. And there's research actually looking at people who are able to describe their negative emotions, like how they're feeling, rather than just being like, I feel good or I feel bad. But those who are able to kind of really be precise with their language around
Mm.
like, I'm feeling, overwhelmed because of this, or I'm feeling irritated because of that, or even I'm feeling deflated, or really getting as specific as possible, even like whipping out a thesaurus to figure out like how am I feeling? Because otherwise that sort of blob of negativity can really
Sure.
hover over you for such a long time. And being able to, once you get specific about it and you can pinpoint it, you don't take it as personally,
Sure.
it doesn't feel as pervasive or as permanent. And again, you're much more likely to be able to act upon it.
Sure. So before I open it up to questions, I think I'm going to call the game on COVID questioning, but I can't let this one go. Have you found in your, kind of personal life and your professional life, have people kind of snapped back to sort of where they were pre-COVID in most senses? Have people taken real learned lessons, reprioritized their agendas? Are there things that you've taken that you personally have really, have stuck that we could all learn from?
It's been so interesting looking at this period, and I had patients I was really worried about going into the pandemic and actually who had like anxiety, and they were the ones then, week 3, and I was saying like, are you okay? And they said, oh, I'm great. Like I've been waiting for this all my life, and this idea that they were actually being in the position, like I'm like giving advice to my, like typically, these paragons of sanity, my friends who've always thought that they've got it going on. Like I'm in this position of like, being able to help them. And because I've always had all of these strategies to deploy, that I go for a walk in the park when I'm stressed out, or I, listen to my favorite song, or I call this person, that they had all these like ways to help themselves through that. But reentry has been really interesting. And, because there's been all these sort of false starts as well. And I think there is this sort of psychic rust. We don't even know how to like interact with each other, or talk to each other in person anymore. But what I've been telling people is, we all know that like social interaction is so helpful, but I know a lot of people have been feeling a lot of like social hangovers.
Sure.
They go out once, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't handle it like that. And to really be thinking about like the social interactions that are the most meaningful to all of us are either like having a meaningful conversation. And so few people in surveys feel that they have a meaningful conversation on a daily basis, but like, having those like feeling like where you've learned something, where you feel understood and you feel heard. And really in groups of like sort of more than 6, you can't do that. So I've been saying like, say yes to those small dinners, but maybe no to those like bigger things that maybe you feel overwhelmed by, and saying yes to those things that you value most. But a friend of mine, this is an analogy a friend of mine gave me, is, well, when you go to a nutritionist and you're trying to sort of you're going on a food elimination diet, you've removed all the foods that make you feel sick, and then you slowly add back foods in that don't make you feel like ill. And that basically all of us have been on this social elimination diet, only add back in, the people that make you feel good. And I think that there is some truth in that. And I hope that we are like sort of just maintaining some of those changes, because about, I think it's 80% of people feel that they report something positive. They've reshuffled their priorities. They've actually, amazingly, we haven't seen tons of divorces yet in the wake of COVID-19. And I think it was Prince Philip who had said, when he was asked about, had he ever thought about divorcing his wife, Queen, that he had said, well, divorce never, murder often. And I think that was, probably the way many people felt. But it's sort of surprising in this moment where I think people were predicting that people would really, be at each other's throats. But actually, this renewed appreciation. Apparently, 80% of partners didn't know what their spouse did for work, and now they do. Yeah. So that's also been a revelation.
That's really fun. Terrific. So maybe we'll get to questions, start with folks in the room. I don't know if there's a microphone to pass around, but please, everybody, don't be shy. We have to show the benefits of being in person here. Please. I think for the video.
Hi there. Thanks so much for coming in. This has been really great and so nice to see all of you in person. Sorry to those of you online. So I became a parent during the pandemic, which has been a wonderful new adventure. What does all of this mean for raising children, especially in this moment in time where we don't get to interact with nearly as many other people and parents as we would like to?
Thank you. No, it's such a great question. And I think there's a lot of anxiety around all of this, but and the main concern is sort of avoidance. Will kids, be avoidant? But, my strongest recommendation to you would be having your child socially interact within your bubble, have as much as possible free playtime. I mean, how old is your little one? But having those social interactions, I think, is so critical to our well-being and our development. And, within whatever is safe for you, it's so important. And that's what I've been most concerned about. But again, we've had a lot of surprises, and let's not forget, children are unbelievably resilient. And it's important to keep in mind and not always sort of be mining for issues like, are you really okay? Are you really, really okay? And that, a 1-year-old's not thinking that though, but creating that sense of normalcy, free play. There's a huge movement. And I think we have seen not just helicopter parenting, but now drone parenting. Just seeing this like overly fearful parenting, and we're almost told now, unless we are protecting them at all times, that we are, somehow bad parents. And that idea of giving them just some free range at 1 year old, that's too young. But giving kids that sense of like the three most important, I'd say, just well springs of well-being are a sense of belonging, that you feel loved and that you love others. Also a sense of competence, that you feel like you have the ability to tackle something, and also a sense of autonomy, that you have choice in something. And there's a great study that came out of Yale looking at parents who actually exposed their kids to some of their struggles. And actually their kids, they were just there to watch parents try to like struggle opening something. And that the parents who persisted, and then the kid is presented with a similar like thing to try to open something, that they're much more likely to persist when they've seen their parents persist. And there's interesting research looking at children who are resilient, who actually know their family's history. They know the ups, they know the downs, they know it was difficult, they know their challenges and their episodes that were really hard, they know that there were triumphs and difficulties, but actually having, again, that sort of arc of time where they're able to, well, your grandparents, where did they meet? How did they sort of get to know each other? What was difficult? What was, and to having those conversations, your kid's too young right now around the dinner table, and having those kids who have that sense of their family history are going to be more resilient, because I think they have a sense of like, it's not all about me. Go back to your other question.
Great question. Great.
Hi, thank you again. I was struck when you were talking about the Springsteen reference earlier. I was thinking back to this podcast about, I think it was a TED Talk actually from Amy Cuddy, about that sort of fake it till you make it construct. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the stress that comes with the fake it till you make it, but also the opportunity as well.
It's super great point to make. I think fake it till you make it is almost assuming that you need to like suppress your emotions. And I think that is where that becomes really problematic. Like grin and bear it, smile. Like if you're working at the Gap, just put a smile on your face. And that is really toxic. And, we know that that's bad for your heart rate, your blood pressure, and has long-term, I think mental and physical consequences of that. But I think where her research is so great though, I think, is where she's talked so much about embodied, your embodied health. And, if you make yourself larger, if you're having a meltdown at work, one of the best things you can do is just get up and go and just physically move yourself in space. And I think that idea of when you can make yourself large in space, you can expand and have your shoulders back and you feel large in the world, that's the work that she was talking about, that I think it was just saying, puff up and be large. And when you're physically able to sort of move yourself, you're much more empowered in some way. And I think there is real, I mean, there's people were criticizing that in the beginning, but I think there's tons of research now behind that. She was looking at, I think it was Harvard Business School, that, women would raise their hand and be like, I've got a question. And then like men would be like, I've got a question. So that sort of idea that, if you could, just expanding in space, and not for all of us to be manspreading, but to be sort of thinking of ourselves in an embodied way outside of our heads, I think is really, really important. But suppressing emotions is not a way to just grin and bear it. And I think that's really detrimental to our mental and physical health.
Dan.
Yes.
Thanks, Karen. It was really, I loved listening to you, and I particularly appreciated that you talked at the beginning about sort of over pathologizing. And I wonder, you talked about counseling your friends as well. And if a friend came to you, I think there are some of us who sort of have we approach ourselves that way, where it's just sort of this laundry list of things that we should change. How do you counsel people about when something rises to the level of you really should take a look at this and maybe think about changing it, versus here are some ways to get more comfortable with this and maybe sort of diminish your discomfort with this part of yourself?
What's great, I think that idea of sort of accepting also who you are in ways, it's not to say, we can change if we'd like to become more conscientious, there is, research around that. And it's not, you can't just think I'd like to be more conscientious. It's actually sort of following through and acting in the way that a conscientious person would act. And almost, I think, when we're well-intentioned phonies in a way, and that we're doing things that feel, not faking it till we make it, but I think when we're feeling sort of, it actually does feel more authentic in that true way to ourselves. But also looking at that level of self-acceptance. And we know people who are over 55 and 60 is where it seems that people in general get happier. And part of it has to do with, we're sort of like fine wines. I think we get better as we get older, because I think a lot of that little stuff doesn't bother us as much. And there's an appreciation for those small things and little things, but also there's this sort of self-acceptance and that less sort of judging of who we are. And I think we're not, if you're clearly not close to that age right now, but it's this sense of, I think, how do we sort of accept ourselves the way we are? And I think there's lots of things we can't change. And there's this emotional equation that anxiety equals uncertainty times powerlessness. And uncertainty is a lack of knowledge, and powerlessness is a lack of control. So, but then the sort of turning that on its head, what do you know and what can you control? And I think when you sort of can distill that, then if there's things you feel like working on. But again, I think our whole sort of self-help culture is you're not good enough, you need to change. It's also something that I think, in just this idea of pathologizing anything, you've got a problem, I've got a pill for you, is, and I've got a diagnosis for you, is not necessarily some things that we do, or some things that maybe we see as our weaknesses can sometimes be our biggest strengths in ways, and that we have so much to learn. And finding, even there's a wonderful woman called Ellen Sachs, who when she was, I think she was in college, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and her parents were told, take her out of school.
Amazing story.
She's going to not have, she's not going to be fully functional, get rid of all the stress in her life. That is, it's going to destroy her. She will probably be hospitalized over and over again throughout the arc of her life. And she said her parents accepted her diagnosis, but wouldn't accept this prognosis. She had resources, she had help, she had therapy, she had medication, and she went back to school, where she graduated from there. She also was hospitalized a number of times in between. She went to Oxford. She got a law degree. Now she's a champion of mental health law, and she won a MacArthur Genius grant. And she says her training has been unbelievably helpful to her. And she said, people like me tell her to remove all the stress in her life and get rid of anything that, that she should have been working as a cashier somewhere. But how having this sort of meaningful work has really saved her life. And she has another colleague who's a lawyer. And she said that he uses, whenever his voices get loud in his head, he has schizophrenia. And he said when his voices get loud, he sort of uses his legal training to say, what evidence do you have for that? And this idea, though, again, that we have this, she's an amazing woman. And I think a wonderful example of the way I think that people you can't, it's for us as psychiatrists to say that's a schizophrenic. No, that's somebody who has schizophrenia, but who's also, has found wellness within her illness and is working well. And for those who are just the worried well, how can we find wellness within some of our challenges? And I think that's what I really try to work on in this book as well, is to kind of give people that and not say you need to change, but how can you cultivate more of the things that make you feel good rather than taking things away? Looking at like New Year's resolutions, like you can stop smoking, you can lose weight, all those things, but what about doing more of the thing you really enjoy doing? And that's sort of, I would recommend.
I mean, related to Dan's question, and you talk about it in the book, I found so much of the conversation in particular around, true self versus your aspirational self to be sort of almost a conversation about a static and dynamic view of yourself, right? We're always changing. And I think to be the optimist, I mean, one of the most amazing things is not everybody who's as young anymore, neuroplasticity and the ability to change, right? I think I at least often say, I am this already, I'm sort of stuck, and that's what it is, but that's not true. I mean, I think we all have probably a greater capacity for change and evolution in a dynamic sense than maybe we're aware of.
And to your point, that there's a woman at Harvard, she's the first tenured woman professor there, called Ellen Langer, and she had said when sometimes couples would come to her after 40 years of marriage and say like, oh, I'm just so sick of him, or I'm just so sick of her, like she's always doing this, and I know, and here we go again, and he's about to do this, and I could like predict like moment to moment exactly what he's going to do in the morning when he gets a newspaper, and then he's going to do this. And she said nobody's ever come to her and said, I'm really sick of my kid, or I'm really sick of my dog, or I'm really sick of this plant here, because of this expectation that they're going to change. And that like you think your plant's going to change, you're expecting like your dog to do something funny, but you're not. How the people who we're closest to, sometimes like our partners, we're just thinking we know them so well, and we have this assumption of knowledge that's actually kind of flawed. So she'd always given this advice was, look for 3 things that are different, and look for difference in the person you're with, rather than sort of that expectation that they're changing. And even looking at studies of kids going into high school on that point is when they learn that they're going to change, and also the people around them, the other students, are going to change, even they have different attitudes if they are more bullies themselves, like recognizing that they're going to change, but also that they have less aggression towards like kids that they're not friends with, knowing that they're going to change. And so I think it's so important to kind of keep that in mind, and not just in ourselves, but also knowing that others are also going to be changing too.
Who else out here? Right behind you.
Thank you so much for being here. This is fascinating and inspiring. Lots of good ideas. So my question is about like this COVID. So it's related to COVID and this idea that life is short, right? So we've all known people who've passed. I had an ex-boyfriend who died from COVID. Like my super died. I just have seen that. And what it brought up for me during this last 18 months was, oh shit, life is short, we got to get this. And as time goes on and as we go back to normal, I can feel that like hunger to grab it sort of, dissipating a little bit. And so what is that silver lining that COVID brought out, and how can I grab it and not lose that? I don't want to lose that. It was almost like a peak when the sun shone through the clouds. And I was like, wow, life is precious.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so, but I mean, that point you make about loss, I think I just read this study that looking at, we've lost over 700,000 people in the US, and for every person lost, there's 9 people on average who are grieving for them, so you look at, that's like 6.3 million people in the country who are grieving and who are mourning, and that can, I don't want to pathologize grief at all, but how that can lead to depression as well. And I think that loss is something that we do need to be thinking about, and knowing so many people around us, and we're hearing about all this anger right now, and people are so angry. I think grief might be sort of contributing to just people having a very hard time. But to your point about finding that silver lining, and how do we maintain that? And one of the biggest things I think in psychology and psychiatry that we've had a challenge doing this. We know how to change people's behavior in the short term. Like we're pretty good. Like I can get you to stop smoking for 2 weeks, or, to do something that you want to do. But what's that long-term thing look like? And so just harnessing the power of what we know right now for long-term like behavior change would be, like if there's something specific you love doing, to start doing that, to hold yourself accountable to doing that, to find a friend that you can do it with. And like thirdly, just to expect relapses. But I think the idea, like anytime there is, to harness something called the fresh start effect, like anytime, we all know that New Year's resolutions that usually come and go, but whenever there's an opportunity, if it's every Monday, the beginning of each month, it's around a birthday, hold yourself accountable. And usually that helps when there's somebody else checking in with you to be like, are you actually doing that thing that you said you really wanted to do? And that you're much more likely to follow through with it when there is some accountability around it.
Just being sensitive to time, I know we have probably time for a couple more questions. I have no clue how to do this, but can we do this with anybody on video? Ask if there are any questions. There are none on video. All right, so I'm going to put more pressure on everybody in the room. There we go.
What do you think about this concept of obsession over productivity? I feel like you feel it a lot in New York, and you feel like almost guilted people into thinking if you're spending an afternoon on Netflix or relaxing or doing nothing, that it's somehow bad. You should be doing something. And going back to the couch potato syndrome, it's like, do you think some of it has to do with a person guilting themselves that I shouldn't be doing this, even though it is a part of relaxing?
No, you make a really good point. I'm glad we can clarify that. I think that's how important it is to relax and to recharge, and sometimes do absolutely nothing. I think a lot of people's recharging is, oh wait, I'm going to look at my phone right now, and that is actually quite depleting. And a lot of those things we're doing are depleting. But I think it's when you're spending like a weekend in bed binge watching that can feel kind of depleting, though. But we do live in this world of productivity porn. And almost that bragging. I remember people sort of bragging, and when I was in medical school, like my circles under my eyes are like darker than yours are, that way of, and not trusting. I remember seeing somebody who was always like looking really well rested, like clearly she didn't work that hard, but that idea around that productivity porn and how can we do it like faster and better, and we can, create more. But again, I think that's where like this ideas of like doing things outside of work and doing things that you just do for the joy of doing it, and even like embracing like mediocrity, like doing things that actually aren't just all about perfection. And we're seeing this, especially with young people, this idea of like perfectionism being on the rise, and people who are so obsessed with being perfect in their work lives, in their social lives, and they're seeing it on social media as well, about how perfect things should be. And that idea of, I think it is sometimes in having things you do outside of work where you can really just kind of do it halfway, and actually make peace with that. Even like, I have a friend of mine who like, whenever she's made peace with like giving up a book halfway like through, she's like, I'm not going to finish this.
That was a big one for me. It's
so liberating to do that.
It's a huge one for me.
Or even like be like a mediocre cook, like whatever those things that you do, and actually embracing that and feeling good about the things that like you don't have to be. So I think in pursuit of perfection and productivity that can really, I think, undermine any opportunities where we do have to recharge and to relax and to feel better. One thing we haven't talked about that much is rumination. I think productivity can become like really like you can almost be like ruminating, like how can I do more and more and more? And even just being in nature is so valuable. And you guys look at a beautiful park here, but I think we have nature deficit disorder, and that when we do spend time in green spaces, there's studies showing that actually we are, like even the natural language studies looking that where people are happier, they're more content, they're ruminating less. And looking at studies of like mothers who go to a mall with their daughter versus to the park, not only do they get along like better from that trip in the park and that walk in the park, but it actually sustained for longer. For like 6 days afterwards, they report like having like better relations after that. But doing those things that actually feel like a waste of time can actually be the most like beneficial. And getting back to that part of just even like doing things that are just purely fun, that you're just doing for the joy of it, that or you're doing with somebody else, and like taking those breaks. And we know that people who take breaks, actually multiple breaks in the beginning of the day, even we often wait till like 3 o'clock to go like get that coffee or go out of the building or, go get something, but actually taking breaks earlier on too, and giving oneself a true break though, which isn't like, oh, I'm going to check my phone one.